All right, let's move on now to task 2, step 4, and how you can go start to put some labels on these map features. I'll guide you through the general process, and if you look at the tutorial instructions, there's more of the specifics you can do because there'll be several iterations of adding labels. Let's start with these points of interest, and I'll turn things off just to make it a little cleaner to look at. And so to start with labeling, a couple ways you can go about doing it. You can start by right-clicking on a layer and doing the label properties. And this brings up an interface you can use for setting what are called the label classes. The idea of a label class is that each type of symbol can have its own sort of class or settings specific for that particular feature in terms of how you want the label to look. And this again is another case where you can look at one of the base maps to get some ideas, because in cartography, the size of a label and so forth, as you heard about earlier in the lecture part of these videos, can reflect the importance of something. For if you look here, you see this word Forest Glen, which is for a populated place, Scranton, Carnegie, and so forth. And so you can set label classes accordingly depending on what it is. So to do that, let's do that. Let's make labels for our map for the civil. And to do that, let's create a label class for the civil. Now, you'll have a default class 1, but to create a new specific class, you can click here on the menu and say create label class, and we're going to call this one civil. And this will be labels that are just for civil points on the map. And a really handy thing that you can do to create your classes, if you were to look at the attribute table, you can use SQL statements to filter the type of label class. So if we look at this field here, feature CL, feature class, we can see all the various things on our map. And then earlier in the videos, that's what we use to create the symbols. So what we're going to do, we'll first go over to this button here, SQL query. We'll create a new expression. And I'll just use the fields. So where the feature CL is equal to civil. So I'll apply that. And then I'll go back to here. Now, it's outside the scope of this video to talk a lot about this, but you have a couple different languages you can use. There's a specific language called Arcade that is used in ArcGIS Pro for labeling map features. And so what you do here in the expression is where you actually say what it is that you want to have as a label. So we've already filtered it. It's only going to show labels for features that are of the value civil. And then we want the feature name. And if I apply that, and then you have to actually go back over sometimes and tell it to label. Now, when I did that, it's not exactly what I wanted because I actually have this other label class, this class 1 that was sort of the default that was there. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that one because it was adding the map name. So just keep those classes in mind if there's one hanging out in there sort of that you don't recognize. But now with my SQL statement I had for just civil, if I zoom out a little bit, you can see some of my labels for those particular civil points are there. Now what I can do is go back and make modifications. So as one example, I could change the way the text is. Because something like the civil point, like indicating the village, that's of more importance in the visual hierarchy. I'll make that a 14-point font. And you have all kinds of options for changing the symbols around. Um, Here you see in these dialogues some important things. Here you see from earlier in the videos where the labels get placed. Now, the software will try to find the best position, but you can, of course, modify those if you have a more specific way to do it. So definitely take a closer look at these depending on what you're trying to do. Sometimes this can be helpful to remove duplicate labels, especially when we look at the lines, that'll be a thing. And so that's the basic idea. So create label classes for all of your different levels of map features. And let me show you what the final results of that look like. And again, I'm not going to go through every single label class creations. So look in the tutorial instructions for some specific ideas on how you can set your labels up. So here we see now, I went ahead and added another class called points of interest just for everything else. And you can see how compared to the civil label, the different kind of font and the, lighter color. And again, all about that idea of the visual hierarchy. What is the most important thing in the map? And so you make that more visually prominent and so forth. And of course, I should mention, you do have, when you click on you have some of the labeling functionality that you saw in this dialog over here. It might take a little practice to go back and forth between which one works best for you. They have different things they do. So let me show you really quick now about labeling the roads. So I have the default class 1, and I'll give you an example of what you can do for interstates. So I'm going to rename class 1 to interstate. So in this case, the interstate is this yellow line here. And I'll do the same thing like I just showed you with the points of interest. I will give it an SQL statement. And the specific values to use are in the tutorial instructions. So in this case, an interstate is a CFCC that's equal to A15. So that sets up that I'll only create a label for this. Now, this is a case where you can go back and you have to, I think, my understanding, you go back and forth. Now, if I wanted to put a highway shield, I can make my text symbol for the interstate one of these US interstate highway shields. And then I've already got the default set to the feature name. So check that. And then to actually turn the label on, I can click here, enable labeling. I can also right click and do label there. And so you can see when it does that, it takes that value of the feature name from the arcade expression and it's putting it inside of that text symbol that I picked here. Now, if you look up here, we'll look at some other things you can do with roads. The local roads are a good example of this. So I'm going to create another label class, and this will be just for labels for those local roads. And you can see right out of the gate, it comes out kind of as a big mess. So to start cleaning this up, we'll again use the a SQL expression. And again, refer to the tutorial instructions on the specific values to use. And so I just copied out of the instructions. I'll use SQL this time. And here's the SQL clause that you use, because those are all, if you remember earlier in this videos when we created the symbols, we combined classes together to make the road layer. We just basically combined a bunch of CFCC values. So that'll give me a filter in that regard in terms of what's in this particular label class. And now, again, visual hierarchy, these are just local roads. They don't need to be this visually prominent. So I can go and modify the symbol. In this case, I'll make it a much smaller font, maybe 6 points, and I'll make it a more subdued kind of gray color, and I'll hit apply to see how that looks. And you can see already how they're starting to kind of not be as visually prominent. And another thing you might consider is changing how they are positioned on the street itself. And that's again where some of these tools come in really handy, where you can, for line features, they have some interesting things. I encourage you to play around with these. You can see how this puts them right on the line, offset horizontal. And again, it's up to you to determine how you use these things, but just keep these positions in mind. Street placement, street address placement, and can be really helpful. This is a case where you might want to remove duplicate labels, especially when you have features. In fact, yeah, I think we just saw that here. So if you see here, notice this says null and null because it's several features. So this will allow you to remove any duplicates. So you only have one word there. Okay, so I went ahead and added sort of the final roads layer, and this whole project will be available for you to look at in terms of how I did it. But so if you notice that the colors of the lines look a little different, that's my modifications I made. Now, one thing I wanted to mention, you don't necessarily have to do this for if you're doing this tutorial, but it is important to mention is the idea of annotation layers. Annotation layers are basically when you've created the labels, you can then turn them into sort of smart objects that you can move around. So right now what you're seeing is ArcGIS Pro is adjusting the labels automatically as the map zooms around. And a lot of times that's sufficient, but you may find when you get to a point, for example, this map is going to be, we're constructing it at 1 to 20,000 scale. And you may find that once you have things set the way you want, you need to do fine tune adjustments that are different than what the automated labeling can do. And that's where an annotation comes in. So just to show you this, I'm going to make a copy of this layer. And to make annotations, what you do is you right click on your layer, convert labels to annotation. And it's basically going to store these in your geo database. And I encourage you to go through all the different settings if you don't need to use the whole extent and so forth. But this is just a quick demonstration of how this would work. So what it's doing now is it's taking all the settings from your road layer, from their in terms of their labels, and it made it its own layer. And if you look now in the table of contents over here, we have this thing called Group Anno. So notice when I turn, it's basically now all those labels from roads have become graphics on the screen. And so reason that's important, they sort of are now frozen at 1 to 20,000 scale. If you were to turn off, yeah, so it automatically turns the labels off. And now what I would do though is edit these annotations just like they were a feature. And what I mean by that is if I have that layer selected, the annotations, I go to edit and I select modify. And so you can see now I selected that word camp and I can move it if I wanted to. I can do whatever I want with it. And this can become incredibly helpful when perhaps you need to start really fine tuning labels and their placement that go beyond something like that. Because with the automated labels, they're going to jump around and so forth. So annotation layers are really helpful for I would consider it the final presentation of your labels, because once you create them as annotations, depending on your licensing of ArcGIS Pro, you may not be able to go back and modify them. So keep annotation layers in mind for the final fine tuning of the placement of labels, their values, and everything else. And you edit them just like you would a regular feature layer. Hi, this is Brian Tomaszewski. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, and share this video. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel and clicking the notification icon to stay up to date on new videos from this channel. Thanks for watching.